Book looks super high quality.
We are live. Well, no, we're not live this time, but this is podcast number 100.
We're live for the digital computers.
We're live from our own computer screen.
Yeah, exactly.
But welcome to podcast 100, where we are going to review some arguments that get tossed at Christians that we've come across. You know, there's going to be an endless list of this, but the ones that we've kind of come across on a recent basis, Dave and I recently have been talking to a Muslim at the gym who is throwing out some of these arguments, but I think secular people, you're going to see some of these arguments. And today we're gonna hit on two of them. Likely, if we have time for more, we'll expand, but it'll probably be a multiple part series.
Right on.
And
you want to tell them what what is apologetics for some of the guys? And first off, I do want to say, any of you guys listening that have been here with us from episode 1, get in the comments. We want to know. I want to know. Okay.
The true followers,
man. All right.
I mean, apologetics basically means to defend one's position, one's faith.
Right.
It doesn't mean to necessarily like apologize as we know the word apologize in everyday life, but more so to give a defense of what you believe.
Very good. Very good. So it deals with arguments, validating an argument and constructing an argument. So it's good stuff.
And yeah, I think it'll help you a lot in your confidence on talking about your faith.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of us, you know, when we're naive Christians, we don't want to talk to our coworker or our neighbor about our faith because we're worried these questions are going to show up and we're not going to have answers and look dumb.
Exactly. We forget that looking dumb is the way to learn.
Yeah.
So don't be afraid of looking dumb.
No.
There's answers to this stuff, as you will find. See this book that David has with the beautiful pictures? It's full of answers. And there's thousands of them written by intelligent, big-brained brothers and sisters of Christ that have taken time to do research and develop good rebuttals. Right?
And you'll find out, too, that the more conversations you have, the more it's like the same list of kind of like 10 questions.
Isn't that funny? So you begin to get confident, right?
Yeah, you almost predict where they're going to go next on their rebuttal.
That's a good place.
So it makes it a lot easier to have those conversations. You can have confidence in them. And then you can also, like, if you don't have an answer for them, don't feel like you have to stammer some answer. Just be like, you brought up a good point. I'm going to go look into that.
That's the best way. I mean, honestly, we're taught to be creatures of humility. And that's going to draw somebody in when they see like an honest representation of humility. And then you come back and say, hey, you know, I actually thought about that. I did some study on that. That's building a bridge brick by brick. I took what you said seriously. I went home and did some research work. And now we're talking again. You know, that's good. That's good stuff.
Exactly.
I think the interesting thing about apologetics is just in watching like Cliff and Stuart Nettle, they do apologetics at a lot of college campuses, is basically they face kind of like the same 10 questions, but each of them is just posed in a different variation or whatever. But it's kind of like, it's almost like there's only 10 things you really need to know because those are the main questions that the majority of people are going to ask.
Yeah. It's so true.
And so it's not like you have to, you know, you don't have to know your Bible inside and out. I mean, it's great to know a lot that's in there, but this isn't like this huge undertaking in order to be able to defend your faith, because you're not really going to face a ton of variety, I guess.
It's true.
Like there's just a handful of like main questions that people have, or a couple of points that they disagree with or whatever. And
they're basically, a lot of them are like meme level questions.
They
too.
are.
I mean, yeah.
There's no, they didn't come up with it.
No.
They heard it on an Instagram reel.
Sounded like a KO to them.
Yeah.
So they repeated it. But you know, what's interesting is if you feel like, I know there's those people out there who just want to be prepared because they're afraid of, you know, looking like they don't have an answer. And maybe that shows that their faith is weak. That's not the case. Like going back to what we were talking about with Mike, it's good for them to see you be humble and to say, I'm going to study on this. And usually that's God telling you it's time to study on this. So like, you don't have to know everything.
Oh, absolutely.
To get in there and start talking about stuff. You don't.
100%.
Yeah.
Like, hopefully most people give you the grace enough where if you like don't know an answer, like it's not that you're wrong.
Yeah.
It's just that you don't know.
Yeah.
And so it's okay to not know, but I mean,
Don't let that keep
studying
you from
apologetics-
exploring somebody. Don't let that keep you from asking questions. Don't
Yeah.
let that.
But even like studying apologetics, like that has tremendously helped my like faith and like reliance on the Bible and everything.
Mhm.
Because it's like, oh man, there's all this stuff that like I've studied deeply about, and it's just been a tremendous thing that you can lean on.
Yeah.
You know, if you're struggling with anything at any time, you're like, no, I know that this is true.
Yeah. I feel like apologetics predominantly works on Christians.
Yeah,
I mean,
You know,
yeah.
well, and that's the big.
Just
That's
being
a huge,
honest.
That's a big point because I
Yeah.
think it's you're studying it not to evangelize per se, because you're never going to win someone to Christ with an
No,
argument.
usually not.
I think that's what you'll find with you know, when I was young and zealous in the apologetic study. You think you can go win people to Christ with arguments. You can't.
No.
But in the
You
end,
can piss them off.
yeah,
You know,
if you're
that's
ultimately
still
it's
fun.
just, it's
but
how
not great.
people are. Like even if you have the right answers, it's just going to make them retreat into their shell more because
Yeah.
they're wrong, and then it's just how humans are. So I think
Yeah.
it ultimately will just help your faith.
A good point is apologetics is not debate.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because like a polemic debate is meant for two opposing people who know their arguments really well, and they also know the guy's other arguments, so they're aware of both sides.
Mm-hmm.
And those are usually, they can sound argumentative, but it's a debate. When you're developing and administering an apologetic presentation to somebody, it should be viewed more as ministry and like helping somebody to understand, or just having a relation. It's more relationship based. You should see it more as developing a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what am I accomplishing by doing this? Is this person receiving this? When to ask questions about them? What are you doing to actually build the relationship? That's where apologetics gets work done.
Mm-hmm.
Because if it falls into an argument sort of debate thing, you're going to lose ground with that
Yeah.
person, most likely.
Most likely,
Yeah,
unless they're
not every
hyper
time.
rational and
They love
can-
it.
Can be, yeah.
Yeah.
And that kind of, well, that'll lead us into the first question, because this comes, I think a lot of these conversations you're going to have are going to be around these types of questions, but what you're ultimately doing with the question is showing their little thought they put into it.
Mm-hmm.
So
That's a good point, Mike.
yeah, so there's no order to these. They're not exhaustive at all, but this first one is the person that will come at you. They may be an atheist, they may not be. They might be, you know, just kind of a spiritual but not religious person. But
I feel like that's the brunt of those guys.
yeah. So they're going to come at you with the, you know, they might not even rebuttal your Christian views, but they're just going to be like, oh, that's good for you, but you know, all roads kind of lead to God. And this argument will kind of come in a few different forms, but ultimately they're saying like all religions are valid. Like you're Christian, that's cool for you. You know, maybe I'm Muslim, or maybe I just view all religions are valid, and pick what suits you, and you know, have at it. And that's a super common, I would say, view today in this like tolerance and acceptance thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then especially with this like you know, inclusivity,
yeah,
like method,
Yeah.
because religion in of itself, that's kind of the first point with this, is exclusive.
That's right.
And their argument kind of like, that's why it's so naive in when they're saying it, because they don't realize like every religion pretty much is exclusive in their doctrine. Like none of them are viewing what they're saying as a truth statement.
Mm-hmm.
Christianity is very clear on it. Islam's very clear on it. Judaism, Mormons, like none of them are going to say, yeah, your other religions are valid. In their own doctrine that itself excludes.
Yeah. I think a lot of people, especially people who haven't done the study, they tend to think that there's good and bad, and each religion and or philosophy that's out there is going to give you a good description of what's good and bad, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's where they fall into that trap.
Yeah.
Because they're forgetting that religion, if it's Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, take your pick, they have an exclusive calling if you're going to adhere to them. So you can't just have all of them coexisting together in one big happy family. You can't.
In any sort of rational sense.
Well,
And
like some of the exclusives that we can point out, like even in the Abrahamic religions, you know, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, you know, like Islam has this, it's almost like this final revelation that has come to Muhammad. However, like compared to Christianity, and you know, in Christianity you have this Messiah person who has died and risen again, who is part of this Trinitarian God complex, where Islam totally rejects all of that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, there is no Trinity. I mean, that's kind of the main point, is they don't believe in a Trinity, and that's a huge, like, main doctrinal point of Christianity. But then in the same light of, like, Judaism, they also don't believe in a Trinitarian God.
Mm-hmm.
They don't believe that their Messiah has come back. They don't recognize the Christ figure or the resurrection or anything like that. And so even just those specific points, it's like either one of them is right or they're all wrong.
That's exactly right.
Like one of the points I'd written down. It's like, if all religions would lead to God in the end, that would make them all equally true, which is just not even possible, because they all have exclusivity in their descriptions, or they're all equally false, which then it's like, what, like if they're all equally false,
by how are you judging that? That's my biggest question. So in that bullet you have there's a very important association that we have. So the question should be, why does one want to put their faith or belief in a religion? Well, the reason why is the religion defines truth for them. A religious view defines their worldview, defines their view on family. It both qualifies and values things correctly for them and puts it in a hierarchy. That's what truth does. So truth, this is a great example. You can't have truth that's inclusive to all. Truth, by definition, is exclusive. It excludes falsehoods. It excludes deception. And it only has truth. That's why it's truth. So in order for a religion to be true as the dictator of what truth is, that's what religion has done for people and humanity from day one. We know that it has to be exclusive, because the defining word underneath religion, as far as the way that you believe, interpret your worldview, is what is the truth, right? So that's something to understand, because somebody who's like, well, everyone's going to tell you what's good and what's bad. It's like, that might be true on a emotional level, but let's look at what they dictate as good and what is bad. And then you start to see them diverge, quite drastically. Like you said, their gods are completely different. The way their propitiation is carried out, completely different. Some religions, you have to make it on good works, which is pretty much every religion.
Pretty much everyone.
Everything but Christianity, where you have grace, right? So you see these distinguishing factions within it. And you're like, okay, well, maybe it's not just good and bad. Maybe there's more to this. And that's where, like you guys were saying, you're starting to pull back the layers of someone's ignorance, because their definition of religion is what's good and what's bad. Well, they haven't tied that down yet. It's a good opportunity to teach, right?
Yeah.
Good opportunity to teach.
I think you have the opportunity here to you can ask them some questions that makes them want to go dig deeper.
Right.
Like,
let's dig deeper into that, right? So the one right underneath the exclusivity and truth, religion, truth, exclusivity, those three words together, we have just be a good person. How often have we heard that? And how pathetic is that really when you investigate a person's barometer or measuring stick for what a good person is, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of like Living Waters ministry, that Australian guy. He goes up to people and is like, are you a good person? Yeah, I'm a good person. Have you ever lied? Yeah. Have you ever stolen? Yeah. Have you ever looked at porn? Yeah. All right. You're a lying, adulterous thief. And they hear that and they're like, I guess you're right. Are you a good person?
And that's where it goes to, like, these religions that are works based. It's like there's this cosmic scale that has this balance. And it's like, okay, we know we've done bad deeds. Like, I think secular people even know that. And then so if it's just be a good person, what's the arbitrary balance of this scale? Are you willing to bet your eternity on this arbitrary scale? And like, who define, like, I think I written down, like, who determines what qualifies you as a good person?
Yeah.
And then do these morals change with the culture you're in
Mm-hmm.
or the time you're living in?
Exactly.
Like slavery was just fine not too long ago.
Marrying children was fine.
Yeah.
Come on, guys.
Like, did those people scale? Were their scales, like, how did their scales look when they were living in that time? Like, there's so much arbitrariness to that statement.
Yeah. It's a scapegoat. People like living in the nebulous world of I'm a good person. But it's really scary to start to see what sin is. And those are the questions you start to ask, right? It's like, what do you do with all that? Okay, are you really a good person? How many good people do you know? How many good was Gandhi good? No, he beat his wife and he was a piece of crap. Who can you think of one good person? That was great. Yeah, I can. Jesus. That's what, like it's kind of a fun game.
Yeah.
But yeah.
When I was also thinking about the concept, like they'll say, be a good person, do good deeds. Is a good deed, like, what is the definition of a good deed? Is it just not doing bad? Because that, I think, is just neutral action. Like, well, I didn't steal. That's not a good deed.
No.
I think that's neutral. So a good deed is like probably being in service to people, like doing charitable work, like doing something in a good sense. So then it's like, okay, how many of you people that just say to be a good person, you view it as, well, I just didn't do the bad person.
Yeah, and you weren't even given the opportunity to.
Yeah.
Like, you didn't murder someone. Okay.
Yeah. Good job. You didn't murder someone.
Yeah.
Like,
I see that's pushing that pushing the observation even further to make yourself really ask the question of good, even in a good deed. I was having a conversation with my wife and Joe about hospitality because a friend at work was like, I like to go through the checkout lane where there's a person there so I can say, how was your day? Like he was expressing to me that he enjoyed that community. And I was like, that's awesome, man. I really like that. And so he was kind of talking about how he felt uncomfortable in some people's homes when he was invited there. And he's trying to look for the words. And I was like, so you feel like there's a problem with hospitality? He's like, exactly. He's like, what's going on with that? And so I started thinking about it and talking to my wife and Joe and kind of springboarding. And it's a really interesting thing. So you can go to a home where the people are hospitable, but it's more because they want to make themselves look good, right? Then you can go to a home where they're hospitable and it's because they genuinely love you and want to make you feel comfortable, right? So both on the face seem like a good deed, but one is actually a good deed while the other is like a contrivance of the good deed that's self-adulating, And so that's taking it even a step further, which is like the conscience really employed. Like you're telling the truth. When so-and-so comes over, making them a nice dinner, is it just so you can show up good? Or are you doing it because that's their favorite dish? What are you doing? And so people don't ask themselves that question, right? Because they just want to make themselves feel good, And so
I think another comparison with that is just we see over and over again in the Gospels with Jesus calling out the Pharisees. I think on paper, they probably checked all the boxes, did all the good deeds, and they were the furthest from a relationship with God.
To the letter, but their hearts, it's the inside of the cup, the outside of the cup. And that's what allows us as believers to get so much more joy out of good deeds, right? It's a form of worship for us. But yeah, so we all know that we're not.
And I had a couple of verses too to just kind of back up Christianity's exclusivity. Big one was John 14:6-7, where Jesus answered, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. If you really know me, you will know my Father as well. And then this one is kind of implying exclusivity with him in Matthew 7:13-14. Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow is the road that leads to life, and only a few find it.
Another verse I really like is where Jesus, I think he might be calling out the Pharisees, but he's like, you cannot worship money and God. You can only serve one master. And that tells you right there, you can only serve one master. Can't serve a bunch. Doesn't work that way.
Yeah. And I think, a lot of this view also comes from people view a religion like a social club. So then they're not viewing it as a truth claim. They're viewing it as like, well, I just picked this social club because I kind of like it.
Yeah. And that causes a lot of confusion. Yeah.
Yep. I guess
that's that verse that a lot of people get scared by because they view Jesus as this nice guy, And then he's like, you have to hate your family, you know, if you're going to come to
Mhm.
me. You have to hate your family. And people are like, that's just bad. It's like, no, what he's saying is that you have to put him first,
Mhm.
you know, and he's using hyperbole to express that exact, like, you're putting me first, man, not just in your actions. You're putting me beyond your family. Like, you're putting me first so much that it's going to seem on the face of it like you hate your family, right? So it's commitment, it's devotion, it's precision of truth. That's the way it's going to feel. And that's why Jesus had to talk hyperbole, like in hyperbole, was to try and wake people up to the fact that yes, there is one narrow gate, man. You know, like the verse where it's, many of you will say, I did miracles in your name, cast out demons in your name. How do you not know me? And he's going to say, I never knew you. So that speaks to the exclusivity of truth and the profound nature of truth and the implications when you do put your faith in a truth. It should change you.
Yeah. So I guess to wrap up that topic, you know, if they go down the all real roads lead to God or line of thinking, I would say just point out, or I would just ask them if they know that the religions, the major ones anyway, have very much exclusivity statements in their doctrine. Especially Christianity. You can point to some specific verses that we mentioned. But if that is the case, they can't all be true. It's a self-defeating statement in and of itself. And then I'd say if they kind of do the just be a good person thing, they're kind of overlapping, because I think if someone is saying all roads lead to God, they're really just saying just be a good person, whatever social club, religion you pick, who cares? What they're really saying is also just be a good person. And I would just ask them questions like, who or what determines what qualifies you as a good person? And then, like I asked before, do these morals change over time, or are they set in stone? What are some other ones they could ask? Like this balancing scale of good deeds that you say, like, how do you know, like, how are you certain of your eternity with that idea? Like, are you keeping track in your head? Like, how do you know? Are you willing to bet your entire eternity on that mindset? Or do you think there's a truth to be had there?
How are you judged? Yeah. I think if I was to look at a person asking me that question, I would have the instinct to assume that they had a problem with telling someone or some group of people they were wrong. So instead of doing that, they'll say, oh, you're all right. But what I would push them to understand is by saying that you're all right, they're actually saying they're all wrong too. So it's kind of helpful for them to see their position is that you can't have that position just because you want to be the nice guy and not say, well, Islam's wrong or Christianity's wrong, because you want to be inclusive. But by taking that position, you're actually saying you're invalidating all of them. You may not know that, but that's what you're doing according to each one of these faiths. So even though you're afraid of telling people you're wrong, instead of just saying one's wrong or three's wrong or picking a side, you're actually saying they're all wrong. Some people are blind to that. So
cool. Next one is commonly thrown out there, especially by Muslims and others, is the Bible has been translated. They'll either say it's just been translated so many times there's stuff lost in translation, or it's inaccurate, or, you know, name the kind of trope on just the Bible just not being the original text.
Yeah, well, for that one, there is tons and tons of manuscript evidence on the contrary to that claim, to where we can go back over the course of, you know, the past 2,000 years and cross-reference different manuscripts, going all the way back to a lot of the early, or some of the earliest ones are even from like the 2nd century. We can cross-reference all of those, and they all like agree with one another to basically an infinitesimal degree.
Yeah, like
It's not even like a question how much they all agree with one another. And throughout that whole time, there's like over like 24,000 manuscripts. A lot of people like to point to the like I think it's 5,800 Greek manuscripts. Those are kind of the key ones.
Yeah, the Masoretic text, which is in the 1200. The Jews rewrote it because they were angry with the Christians, so they kind of obfuscated some of the prophecies. And then the Greek one, which was like 200 years before Christ. What was that?
Well, that's the Septuagint.
The Septuagint, right?
So the Septuagint, yeah. So that is basically like the whole Old Testament, plus a lot of the deuterocanonical books as well. So, or what we consider the deuterocanonical books. So the Septuagint is like that whole, the whole Jewish story translated from Hebrew by Hebrews into Greek, because that was becoming like the most used language in that area.
Right.
And so that's where we have like the whole New Testament, and that was finished being created, I think, right about the time that Jesus came around. So that's already been done and made.
Yeah.
So then from, obviously Jesus came and, lived his ministry and everything, ascended, and then we start getting, after that, all of the writings of the New Testament. And from that, we have all these tons of manuscripts that just confirm the reliability of the New Testament that you have in your hand today.
Right. You speak to the Dead Sea Scrolls, how that worked
the Dead Sea Scrolls is Old Testament stuff.
Oh, really?
Yep. So that
served to confirm the Old Testament yet again.
Correct. Yep. And those were discovered, I think, in the 40s, something like that.
Yeah, 19. Yeah.
But yeah, so those are just another piece of evidence to confirm the Old Testament is valid in what we're reading today. But then again, all these manuscripts that we have in the New Testament is also evidence of the validity of the words we read today as well.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people will point out too that they're going to say like, oh man, most of these manuscripts were written like 1,000 years later, let's say in like the 1100s or 900s or whatever. But what we have is tons of writings from the early church fathers. You have Clement, you have Ignatius, you have Polycarp, you have all these dudes that have their own writings that we have, and they're all referencing tons of the New Testament scripture.
Mm-hmm.
So like there's there's verses here and there, sure, that we don't have a specific manuscript from the 2nd century, let's say.
Mm-hmm.
But we have references to all that stuff from the church fathers, because all of these letters from Paul and all of these the writings from John and Matthew, they were all being disseminated throughout the churches in like the 1st and 2nd century Christianity. And so it's this whole like
you see
proliferation of all the scriptures that are just being referenced in tons of other writings.
Right. And those references speak to a theology that was developed from those gospel epistle letters. Because how else could have they gotten that theology? Right.
Yep.
So that's how we have to look at it, right? You see men's like Clement, Polycarp, all these men, founding fathers, and their theology is sound, right? And that these letters were being passed from church to church to church. They were being rewritten from church to church. They were materials by which the church is learned and corrected, right? So I don't know. I feel like the expectation to find like Paul's handwritten Corinthians, or I feel like, I don't know.
It's not an expectation we hold on any other.
When you look back at the writings of Aristotle, and he existed 400 or 500 years before Christ. We have like, I don't know, less than 15 copies, manuscripts of everything. And so, but we like don't question any of that stuff.
No,
the Iliad was written another 400 years or whatever before Aristotle, 200 years, something like that.
But we'll give them a pass.
Well, yeah, we don't question
those
it all.
Phoenicians. Just they're good to go.
Yeah, so like these guys that predate Christianity by a long time and have fewer manuscript evidences,
right?
Like we don't question whatsoever.
Yeah, it's kind of a load.
So it's kind of a disservice, in my opinion, of the evidence that we do.
We're just
have
not
of Christianity.
Being equal and fair with the way we're judging,
and that's why it's a meme rebuttal, really.
Yeah,
they don't
really
know what they're even saying, and I think part of it is, like I had written down, is I think I've heard people describe it this way. They think it's like a game of telephone with translating. So they're thinking like, okay, this went from the original text to then somebody translated it into Hebrew, and then it went from Hebrew and somebody translated it into Greek, and then it went from Greek to Latin, and then it went from Latin to, I don't know, French. Yeah. And then we finally end up at English, and it went through this giant game of telephone.
Yeah, it's like
you lose this, you get so much lost in translation. It's like, no, we have the original text, And then the original stuff or the Greek manuscripts, we go to each language. It's not a game of telephone.
It's not, dude. And like, I think people should look into like etymology, right? Like the evolution of a word, how a word can kind of lose meaning as it goes on, like especially colloquialisms or whatever, expressions within a community. Like that's badass, bro. Like I'm pretty sure you said that 50 years ago. It'd be like, you have hemorrhoids, like what's the matter with you, you know? Like that's probably what they would think. So the way that these academics would interpret the manuscript and actually translate it from one language to another, you're talking about scribes here, talking about guys very, very, very high learning that knew what those people were thinking, how they thought. These are scribes for a reason. They understand the language. So it's not a game of telephone, you know. And further research will show you, like Noam Chomsky, he's a linguist. He's actually, I think he's still alive. He shows that no matter what language you go to and where you go from, it's actually a great argument against atheism, because Noam Chomsky proves that language did not evolve. Basically, it couldn't. It's impossible for it to have evolved. But it's a great way to also say the Bible can be perfectly communicated in pretty much any language you want.
Mm-hmm.
You can have that.
Well,
that's possible.
And that's the other thing when you're studying the Bible, like we do, is you often go look at the original Greek words.
You have a lexicon,
to get further context, because sometimes Greek has a lot more words for love than we do. So sometimes you want to know what version of love are they using for our one word of love. And so they're like, you can go look that up.
You can. I mean, the Germans do, the Russians do. Love for a brother, love for a yeah.
You can look at Blue Letter Bible online. You can look up all of the different Greek and Hebrew words and all that kind of stuff. You can also get an interlinear Bible where you can read English and the Greek or the Hebrew like side by side, and you can specifically see, you know, what's what.
Yeah.
So I mean, the access to it is easy and immediate.
Yes. And it's only if you desire to know, again, it's there. You can see. I've been running to a lot of people today. This is kind of off topic, but when I was about 25, I started reading like Shakespeare. I was like, I got to read this stuff because it's in like, you know, all the syllabuses for these guys going to college. It's like, I need to know. So I read Dostoevsky and read a couple of these like, you know, literature classics. And I started to read that shit, dude, in the old language. Like these people, they were playing this. Like there's people listening to Shakespeare. Oh my God. They were so smart back then. Like you couldn't play Hamlet to somebody normally and them understand that. You couldn't do it. So to think that these scribes that were translating the Bible even 600 years ago were like retarded or forgot a letter or did anything, like, no, dude. People in the streets were listening to Shakespeare. They're smarter than you. They were smarter than you at that time.
His vocabulary was like 5 times what we speak now, something like that.
Dude, it was entertainment for them. I mean, you listen to like the first scene in Hamlet and you're tired. You're like, who did that? How did he say? What? Oh my God. You want to pass out. So just because they didn't have computers and all the modern tech does not mean they were any less scrupulous with the preservation of the text.
Yeah. Was there some other stuff you want to cover?
Yeah, so this kind of leads into one of the next things that people will point at Christians and why, like the Bible specifically, you know, it can't possibly be this true document that can be relied upon. And what they say is like, well, you just rely on this book that was written 500 years, 600 years, whatever, 1,000 years after all the events happen. Like everything is just made up. Like these people are just, you know, writing this nice feel good story that's not actually true. And that couldn't be further from the truth. So I'm gonna read off a couple of things.
Do it, Dave.
From this book that I highly recommend anyone who wants to learn deeply about the New Testament. Here. So the book is called The New Testament in Its World. I'll hold it up for you. New Testament in Its World by N.T. Wright. An introduction to the history, literature, and theology of the first Christians. This is a textbook. It is dense. It's heavy. But it's very fascinating. And so I'm just going to read some things as to kind of how we get specifically our New Testament, because I don't want to bother talking about like the Septuagint stuff, that was already created before Christ. So that was kind of just like plopped into this, what we call the canon, the Bible. But first off, to determine what was put in the Bible, it's not like it was just, again, these stories made up after the fact. There was certain criteria that the books in the New Testament had to meet in order to be considered for this compilation essentially being put together. So those are, I'll read off, there's 4 primary ones. All right, so it is generally thought that the church employed several criteria to determine the approved register of sacred books. 4 stand out. Number 1, apostolicity. A text was more likely to be accepted if it was attributed to an apostle or to one of the apostles' associates, and if it actually looked like an apostolic document as opposed to a forgery. The church was constantly aware of the need to get back to Jesus and the apostles. They were not simply empty ciphers for conveying abstract truth. Number 2, orthodoxy. Texts were accepted if they comported with the apostolic proclamation, which crystallized into the rule of faith, in the same way that the Christian gospel was said to comport with the Jewish scriptures. So too did collections of sacred texts have to correspond to the gospel of the churches. Number 3, antiquity. Writings close to the time of Jesus and the apostles, even if not strictly by apostles themselves, were still candidates for acceptance. It was for this reason that many popular writings were rejected as obviously post-apostolic. This applies to 1 Clement, the Didache, and the Shepherd of Hermas. Number 4, Catholicity. And Catholicity meaning obviously the universal church at that time, not specifically to like a branch of the church, like, you know, like Roman Catholic. This is talking about the term Catholic as in universal. So number 4, writings were accepted if they were recognized by a wide geographical distribution of churches. Some centers may have had local affinities for some writings, such as 1 Clement and the Shepherd in Rome. Some harbored suspicions about other books, such as 2 Peter in Alexandria. But what shaped the eventual canonical collection was the overall consensus of East and West. Thus, while many writings were regarded in some loose sense scripture, only those books which were traceable to the apostles, which offered access to Jesus and contained apostolic proclamation, and which were widely venerated, became accepted as canonical. So it wasn't this haphazard, like a lot of people point to this Council of Nicaea, which was hundreds of years later after Jesus. And they said, well, that's when they wrote the Bible and put it all together. And that, again, that's not what that council was about. That council was where I believe it was Constantine had all of the bishops in like the Roman Empire or whatever, all came to debate over this growing sect of people that were Gnostic. So it was this argument over Christ's divinity. And so basically it was a council to determine, based on these scriptures, as to whether Christ was divine or not. And that's what that council was about.
Yeah, they were selecting books.
Yeah, they weren't putting books together. It was 3 groups. One group was called the Arians, and I believe they were the Gnostic side. And then there was 2 other groups who both agreed on Christ's divinity. They only differed based on like their definition of it, but it was a very minor thing.
Another thing to think about is the hyperlinking in the Bible too.
Yeah,
and we have to accept. I mean, you do. I mean, if you're a man of faith or a woman of faith, it's not just a document. It's a supernatural document. It's the Logos. It's a living word, bro. The Bible is God's breathed word, right? So we accept that. It should make sense that it's hyperlinked. But the hyperlinking to somebody who doesn't believe is an awesome representation of holiness in the book, because that's not something anybody could accomplish, let alone all the different writers, all the different times that they lived. That in itself speaks to a holiness within the document, holiness, a completedness. Like that's what holiness means, is complete harmony. Beautiful. That's not something you can fake, man. You cannot fake that. And you could go argue about the Muslim text, the Quran, all these different texts and blah, 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 blah. But the hyperlinking in the Bible is exclusive to the Bible. You won't see that. You won't find that anywhere else. You will not find that anywhere else. Take that for what it is.
Mm-hmm.
It's a freaking miracle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, and even going back to like the claim that the Bible was put together like a crazy amount of time after Christ and after all these events happen. Another interesting thing pointed out is like we have there's basically the early church fathers kind of had their list of scriptures that they were referencing. And so again, like all these guys though, like essentially agreed with one another theologically. They just had like their affinity for different books. Mm-hmm. Or if they had, better access to, let's say, the church in Corinth had immediate access to Paul's letter to them, but then it was disseminated throughout all the churches. Mm-hmm. It only took around 100 years. It was around 180 AD that we had a canon of 22 of the 27 books that we consider in our canon today. So it only took not very long after Christ and not very long after the last books of the New Testament were written did we finally have an entire canon that was almost virtually universally agreed upon in the church. That's called the Muratorian canon. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's just further proof of like this wasn't just haphazardly put together.
And on top of that consolidation, say for instance, there was people just trying to control others and picking their favorite books because it made people easier to control, right? Say for that. How would they go and find all those original texts that existed? Like, it's almost like I see the fact that those texts existed in those little church pockets for a while as a way of protecting it, because they served those documents that were in the Church of Corinthians or Ephesians. They had those source documents so that when the symposium came together and they chose all the books, they had proof those books existed for a while. Mm-hmm. So they couldn't just say, well, this book, because I like this book, and they got a bunch of scribes writing something to make people sheep. It's like, no, we don't have evidence of that anywhere else in these churches that have kept these books. Mm-hmm. So I think of it as like a good insurance against people who want to go through and start meddling, for their own desires.
Well, I'd like to read kind of this section from this book that I think is very good in talking about that, what you're just talking about now. Talking about that this wasn't just an attempt to, herd the sheep that were around you, that it was a universal thing that like was essentially like divinely guided to become the Bible that we have today. So I'll just read this. I thought this was very interesting. I'm actually working through this chapter kind of backwards, but all right. So how we got the New Testament canon. The Bible itself nowhere tells us which books should be in the Bible. So who decided? This is the question of the formation of the Christian canon. Canon derives from the Greek word canon for rule or measure. This question is different when it comes to the Old Testament, and for this book we shall focus exclusively on the New. First, we have to debunk two erroneous views of how the New Testament canon took shape. First, in popular secular imagination, the creation of the Bible was undertaken at the behest of the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, or else by a gaggle of bishops who tried to impose their own narrow brand of Christianity on a previously pluralistic church by restricting the list of sanctioned writings. The Bible as we know it, according to this view, was created to buttress an unholy alliance of imperial and ecclesiastical power by composing and then compiling books that sanctioned a particular version of religions and civil order. Adherents to such a view include those of a post-religious generation and even Ivy League professors. But this theory has more to do with Dan Brown's novel, The Da Vinci Code, than with serious history. It also reflects, with amusing anachronism, the American suspicion of Constantinian Christianity, as supposedly stretching from the 4th century to the 18th with George III, when George III sent bishops to Massachusetts, invoking the modern ideal of political and religious freedom. At the opposite end of this scale, second, there are many who, taught to believe the Bible, treat the New Testament canon as a self-evident and self-authorizing collection. For them, it would only be a slight caricature to say that the church fathers, like early versions of Indiana Jones, went searching for scriptures, finding hidden scrolls in ancient catacombs, or sneaking into imperial palaces to steal confiscated copies of the gospel. Then, equipped with some kind of magic device for telling which documents were quote-unquote inspired, they added their freshly discovered texts to their collection of what became, quote, the Holy Scriptures. The New Testament canon, however, was neither artificially invented by authorities nor discovered by Bible questing adventurers. The church did not create the Word of God. Rather, the church itself is a creation of the Word of God. Jesus himself, the incarnate Word, and the apostolic word of the gospel are what call, gather, encourage, admonish, and sustain the church. However, the church, with all its discussions, debates, and decisions, was the instrument by which the inspired word of apostolic testimony was put into its canonical location, to be seen as an authoritative collection of sacred texts. In other words, canonization is a shorthand way of referring to God's sanctifying work in the ecclesiastical process that led to the compilation and promulgation of the New Testament canon. And now this chapter goes into, much further detail as to how it came together. But it wasn't, again, like you were saying, and like what I was saying earlier, it wasn't haphazardly just decided upon. It was a natural progression to a cohesive measuring stick by which to determine that which is, doctrine, and that which is not.
Mm-hmm. People don't understand how insane it is that anybody agreed on anything.
Yeah.
Especially when there's like barely any money involved. Like, it's just, if you just use your rational mind and say a bunch of Greeks, Jews, whatever, Romans, they got together and made decisions on a canon, and they actually finished that job. Like, that to me is insane that they actually did. It's amazing that it happened. I think so much of this stuff we take on the nose, and it's just like, yeah, it got done. It's like, you don't understand how hard that was to get done. You don't understand
they didn't have a
how serious they were. Yeah, they didn't. They didn't have any of this stuff, man. And they took time with it, and all the churches had to, like, it's mind blowing what you're just kind of taking on the face of, like, yeah, they just all agreed on a book, like a bunch of dudes with beards. It's like, no, there was a really big church involved that was alive and buzzing at the time.
Well, it's kind of like, imagine all the stuff that they could have like tossed out because they're like, well, that I don't want to have to live through that. That sounds,
true,
hard to live out this calling. And, why can't I just make this easier for myself? Like, we'll just have the Beatitudes from Matthew. We'll just keep those, toss out the rest of it.
That would be a man thing, right?
Exactly.
Sounds like a great idea.
But we kept in the hard stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
The Beatitudes are not easy by any means, but like, there's a lot of hard stuff in the New Testament that we're called to live by as Christians.
Yeah.
And it's like, and again, it's
not as hard as child sacrifice, though, in some of those other religions.
Well, yeah, even the Greeks are like, those Canaanites, they're a creepy bunch.
Yeah.
I think we should kill them all. Every bit of them.
But I guess to wrap up this question, so what are some kind of just quick rebuttals that are questions they could return on the original one?
I would say the quickest one I would say is like kind of what you alluded to with Socrates, Aristotle, Homer's documents, the Iliad, stuff like that. It's like, do you believe that's true? Yeah, I do believe in Socrates, man in the cave, whatever, these old stories that exist. It'd be like, okay, well, you know what? That's going off 10% of what the Bible has. So chew on that for a second in terms of, are you judging these documents equally? Mm-hmm. That would be the point of that question. So it's like a Socratic method, ironically. Do you believe that that's true? Do you believe the Iliad? Do you believe these guys actually wrote that? Okay. Well, even Shakespeare, you could use Shakespeare as a more, timely example and say, well, if you're going to use that as your canon, your measuring stick, then do it for the Bible too. That's kind of where I would start.
And I'd probably add, maybe poking into where, like I said, with the game of telephone, if that's the approach that they're thinking about the Bible with, you can probably get that and how they phrase this original rebuttal to you. Just point out how that ridiculous that is. Like, you can just go find the original Greek. It's not a game of telephone.
That's a good point. I don't think a lot of people know that.
Yeah,
it's true. Another thing I would say is like, scribes, people who are in charge of this stuff, like people, this would probably only appeal to like the hyper rational people. It's like, basically, do you trust the guys in the nuclear reactor plants that are, handling your energy that could blow us all up? And be like, yeah, you kind of do. You do, because you live here. Otherwise, you'd live in the desert somewhere. Okay. So I'd be like, you trust them. So these people, they had the same amount of responsibility in many ways, and they took their job as seriously. So we don't have to think because we're critical of a religion that everybody involved was a bunch of assholes or dumbasses. Like, they're very smart people. Let's just have some respect for the fact that they probably believed it was real, and then that was enough impetus and desire to do it correctly.
And you can then, and that goes back to the Greek manuscripts. You got a giant volume of manuscripts. Scribes obviously wrote down. You can compare them. Scholars have compared them. If the scribes were trying to shoehorn in their own biases or change text, like, you would see a ton of massive differences in the manuscripts.
Yeah, and we see that with a good study is Gnosticism, right? Like, that was proliferating and growing at a high rate. But guess what? It died because it had no foundation in Scripture. And as people started to learn Scripture more and understand what they were actually believing, they found it to be false. So it was funny because, again, what survived, what continues to survive, is true, because it becomes a part of that's what nature is. It's something that continues to go on a rhythm, and we see it and it repeats itself. So Christianity somehow, because maybe, my opinion, it's true, has taken over generation and generation. We see the best countries in the world, the best versions of freedom, right? Where does it come from?
I mean, you'll hear atheists, even like Richard Dawkins. He believes Christianity is false, but he's like, I'm a cultural Christian. I want the society it creates, and it's hilarious.
Slap him? Don't you just want to be like, oh really? Oh really, buddy?
Yeah. But yeah, I think, Dave, you anything else?
No, I don't have anything else.
I think we'll call it a day there. We got a list of like 6 right now, so we're at 2. We'll stop at 2, to just kind of give you a teaser as what some of the other ones going forward is why does God have to sacrifice himself to himself? We heard that recently talking to the Muslim of Jesus dying on the cross, and then just the why the Trinity. There's a lot of questions around the Trinity not making sense. Like,
how do you have a monotheistic, deity that's 3 people? Yeah,
the Muslim guy we'll bring that one up because they don't like that. Another one would be the violence and oppression that has been done in the name of Christianity. So they're going to point to crusades or various acts of horror done by Christians.
Inquisition.
The Catholic Church having all these pedophiles and stuff.
Oh yeah,
like, they're going to point to that. And then a very common Muslim one is Jesus never claimed to be God.
I love the parentheses. Do we even
bother with that? So we'll be hitting on those in the future, guys. If you have any questions that you've seen a lot in conversations, definitely hit us in the comments with them, as this is definitely not an exhaustive list. This is the ones that we've personally seen and dealt with. So but yeah,
that was a lot of fun, guys.
Yeah, thanks
Good
for
job,
tuning in,
David.
guys. We'll catch you next time.